I hate making tool review videos. People message me every day asking me to do an honest review about Home Depot's cordless track saws, but I retired from doing tool reviews 15 months ago. I didn't enjoy the process, and I'm not great at testing. The messages persist. And every time I see a fellow influencer do a tool review after being gifted the saw, I get annoyed when they don't tell you the true shortcomings and then claim it's the best new track saw that you should buy, especially if you do so with their affiliate link. I've been using these saws for years and I have a few hot takes. This video is unlike any review video you've ever seen and is sponsored by Shopify. If Fisher-Price made a track saw that used one of the most popular and versatile battery platforms, but was completely ignorant of industry standard track profiles and third-party accessories, then this is what it would look like. It's mostly plastic and feels like a toy. There is a riving knife to help prevent kickback, but it's fixed and doesn't plunge with the blade, which is ironic considering a lot of people call these plunge saws. I'm not sure what Ryobi was thinking here. The hose port doesn't work with standard dust extraction hoses like every other track saw out there, and that's an easy fix, because with the magic of 3D printing, I designed and made my own replacement port so I can hook up my expensive Festool dust extractor to my cheap Ryobi track saw. That's not crazy, you're crazy. Also, I despise the 27.5 split track designs. Getting them perfectly in line is always hit or miss, and for the last 2 years, people have been complaining about the lack of a single 55-inch Ryobi guide rail option. And would you look at that? They finally have one. Glad to see they're getting with the program. Mirroring the saw to the track is possible with these adjustments, but the user experience feels cheap with these knobs. It does have an anti-tipping feature for when you're bevel cutting, but if you're not careful, the screw can come out and you can lose it. Bringing the saw back to do a 90-degree cut isn't as easy as other track saws. The user experience for the depth adjustment is less than ideal, and it doesn't have a fine-tune option. Most track saws use a 6.5-inch blade with a 20mm arbor for whatever reason. Not Ryobi. They went with a 5/8-inch arbor. I gotta give it to Ryobi. They know their customers, and those customers will go to Home Depot looking for a typical 6.5-inch circular saw blade, not knowing that most track saws use a special track saw blade with 20mm arbors. Props to Ryobi for avoiding a customer service nightmare here. The dust collection could be better. Now, if you're going to cut plywood, I've got news for you. Every track saw I've ever tested does just fine cutting plywood. If you have a clean and sharp blade with a high tooth count and a rubber splinter guard in good condition, you're gonna be fine. There's really no difference between track saws. Thicker hardwoods is where the real test is. So I stress test the motors of all my track saws by subjecting them to Tiny Sean. Tiny Sean is this 2-inch thick piece of hard maple. Now, since hard maple is harder than walnut and white oak, I figure if a track saw can handle a single pass cut on Tiny Sean, it's going to be just fine for your walnut and black epoxy trash river table project or your white oak cutting board. Here's how Fisher-Price handled Tiny Sean with the stock 40-tooth count blade. Clearly the saw is suffering, and since I love you, I don't want you to suffer, so we're gonna speed it up to 1500% to get through the clip. It took me 1 minute and 19 seconds to cut 42 inches of solid hard maple. Terrible finish quality, burning too, mostly caused by the wrong tooth count. The stock blade is a 42-tooth crosscut blade, so I swapped it out for a 24-tooth thin kerf ripping blade. Do you think it'll make a difference? Lesson learned, tooth count matters. This pass only took 37 seconds, about half the time as the crosscut blade. Now this is fun. If we stack the clips and play them from the start, you can see how a ripping blade is more efficient at ripping. This saw should cost no more than $199 max, but Fisher-Price sold it to me for $400. I give it a score of 51 out of 100. Solid F-tier material. When I first started woodworking, almost all of my tools were Ridgid. Historically, their price point and quality has been good, and I think they're the only power tool with a lifetime service agreement. So I was eager to see if this was really the best mid-range track saw that all the influencers who got one for free claimed. The build quality of this saw is top tier and really well made. I'm impressed. The depth adjustment scale is easy to use and one of my favorites. I just wish it had a fine-tune adjustment knob. I appreciate the responsive riving knife. I was hoping they would not pull a Ryobi here. Except when it comes to the hose port, they pulled a Ryobi. But we can fix that. Thank you, Fusion 360 and 3D printing. But even with my upgrade available on my website, of course, the dust extraction was noticeably bad, and I'm not sure why. The bevel gauge detents and readability are great. I like the anti-tipping feature, and it returns to 90 degrees accurately. Now, the package that I bought came with two 27.5 guide rails. Boo. But they also make a 60-inch continuous guide rail, and it was included for free when I bought this during a promotion. Yay! The track profile is different from the industry standard, but it still uses regular track saw clamps. And to my surprise, the TSO parallel guides will fit on the rail, so they avoided my scorn there. Now this model must be popular because TSO made a special model of their guide rail square that works with the Ridgid, and they don't do that for lesser saws. These guide rail squares are my #1 favorite track saw accessory. They're not cheap, but they do turn your guide rail into a very long precision square, and for me, getting perfect 90-degree cuts every time saves me time and material over and over the more I use it, and that's how I justify the price in my head. Stop judging me. The quality of these guide rails is amazing. I am genuinely impressed, and I'm a sucker for the dark gray look. Now, most guide rails are 55 inches long, and I like that Ridgid went with the 60 inches. If you ever cross-cut plywood in half, you know just how much you wish the 55-inch guide rail was just a little bit longer. The one thing that I'd nitpick here is the anti-slip grips aren't as effective as they could be. I don't trust them. Now, marrying the saw to the track is a breeze, and the user experience is great with these knobs. Now, like Ryobi, Ridgid broke from consensus and went with the 5/8 inch arbor for their blades. Makes sense for their customer base, I get it. The first thing I noticed when I got the saw was how small the motor housing was. I'm not sure if all motors are that small, but I was curious how this motor would sound and feel. Here's where it got interesting. Two batteries. This shut down. So stopped working, and still have twice the battery. We had a full battery. Max output, 4 amp hours. It's pretty hot, so I'm guessing either this is too hot, so it's turned off, or we broke the motor. This isn't hot, so I think that's the issue. To be honest, I'm out of my depth here. I thought I either broke the motor or the battery overheated. And when I put the smoking hot battery on the charger, the latter was confirmed. It was so hot that I dropped the temperature on my Mr. Cool mini split to 66 degrees to cool down the battery so I could keep going. Now, I'm not positive, but I think the limiting factor here was the battery, but maybe it's also the motor or some combination of both working together. Now, if you're wondering what the real cause was, just go to the comment section and peruse all the theories that smarter people than me will freely offer. Thank you very much. Obviously, using a crosscut blade is bad form, so we switched to a 24-tooth ripping blade, and I was curious to see if the battery would tap out like it did before. We made sure to charge it all the way to 100%, let it cool down, and it was fine. And if you needed another reminder to keep both a crosscut blade and a ripping blade in your kit, here you go. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't get two fair, albeit subjective, times on this cut because the track kept slipping. I was pushing hard, but not harder than any of the other saws. I thought I was going to be really impressed with this saw because of the exterior build quality and that black track. But the motor and the battery can be much better. Now, this complete setup should cost no more than $399, but Ridgid sold it to me for $507, and you might pay more if you don't get it on a promotion, like I did. I give it a score of 75 out of 100. Total C-tier material. Hey, you're probably wondering how I'm coming up with these scores. It's a good question. Well, I created what I sarcastically call the Whitworks track saw rating system. It's not actually trademarked, it's just a joke. I identified 27 different points of consideration and then weighted the point structure to what I think is the most important parts of every track saw. You might disagree with me, and that's okay, which is why I'm giving this away for free in case you want to alter the score or make your own assessment. I also created a detailed written report that outlines my reasoning for scoring the saws the way that I did. I'm trying to keep my thoughts on this video more high level, otherwise it would be very, very long and very, very boring, and you could easily get into the weeds on every single feature of these saws. So if you want that, get the detailed written report. Also, originally, the idea for this video was to compare the 3 different house brand saws that TTI makes for Home Depot. But I know how this goes. Inevitably, people would comment asking me, well, how does it compare to the cordless Makita or Dewalt or Festool or Win? So instead of making a follow-up video to this one, I decided to just throw all of those track saws in this mix so we could see how all of them do and where Home Depot lands in the competition. And just to be clear, I personally paid for all of these track saws full price. I spent over $4,900, and that doesn't include tax or shipping. You will see in this video lots of 3D printed aftermarket accessories for these track saws and tracks. I make those here in the USA. So when people like you buy those products from me, that enables me to buy these track saws without being in the pocket of some of these brands, which means I can make honest review videos without worrying about pleasing a brand or making money off of them. If at any point you find an overwhelming amount of value from the videos that I make, the #1 way that you can help this channel continue to go forward is by buying from my online store. Link in the description, below the like button and the subscribe button. If Harbor Freight made a cordless track saw for under $200, then this is what it would look like and sound like. And feel like. I like that it's mostly metal construction, but the fit and finish is certainly not as smooth and nice as higher end saws. And for $179, I wouldn't expect it to be. Early models of the saw had a black on black depth scale, so at least they changed it here, but I hate the experience of adjusting on this saw. It just feels cheap. The lack of a riving knife or anti-kickback is concerning. I would not cut hardwood that has tension in it with this saw. I've heard of people doing serious bodily damage with this specific saw doing just that. I'm not joking. The hose port does work with standard dust extraction hoses, so that's encouraging. The bevel gauge is trash, but at least it returns to 90 accurately. Win used to sell 50-inch long guide rails, but they've repented of their sins and now offer a standard 55-inch version, which is surprisingly good quality, unless you want the track to not slip when you're using it. The Win guide rail has a standard profile, so if you save money buying the saw, you can splurge those savings on the blue aluminum we all drool over. Marrying the saw to the track is a pleasing and effective task, and the saw uses a standard 165mm track saw blade with a 20mm arbor. The 2-inch hard maple test with the included crosscut blade went as expected, and the real surprise came when we tested the thin curve ripping blade. I love watching these side-by-side shots of the same saw with different blades. And if you take one thing away from this video, it's that tooth counts and thin curve blades are a real thing to know about. I'd rather have a cheap saw with a quality thin curve blade and the right tooth count instead of an expensive saw with a dull blade and the wrong tooth count. I don't love the motor, and I have no idea how long their proprietary batteries would last. Jeffrey Bezos sold the entire setup to me for $248. I give it a score of 64 out of 100. All things considered, D tier. You've heard the phrase, don't reinvent the wheel, right? Well, apparently the product designers for Dewalt have never heard it. There's a lot of weird design choices and quirks about this saw, as if they were trying to change things for the sake of changing them. Can we get some circus music? The fit and finish build quality is top tier, one of the best out of the bunch actually, but they decided to change the way it plunges, and they use this double hinge mechanism, which is really weird and hard to get used to. Kind of like this music. You think we could change to a cartoon track instead? Now, if you're used to circular saw plunges or literally every other track saw in the known universe, you'll find this movement unnatural. I like that they didn't Ryobi-fy the riving knife. It's responsive and plunges with the blade, but mine came bent from the factory, so I guess they found a way to Ryobi-fy it anyway. I thought mine was a one-off, but I did a video on this saw over a year ago, and a lot of people commented that theirs was bent too. The depth adjustment is meh, and I didn't find it accurate, and there's no way to fine-tune adjust it. If you want to quickly adjust and marry your saw to the track, then this saw is not for you. You have to use a hex key, and that's not my favorite. The lack of common angle detents on the bevel gauge is disappointing, but it was accurate when returning to 90. And if you do a lot of bevel cuts, there's no anti-tipping feature, probably due to the dumb track profile. I honestly don't know what Dewalt was thinking here. There's no need to break from the standard, especially if you're gonna make it worse, and the anti-slip grips are suspect too. You can't use standard track saw clamps unless it's a Dewalt brand. I tried Festool, Bessie, and Bow with no success. The lack of a hard edge means no parallel guides, which is one of the best tricks for track saws. But it's not all bad news. TSO eventually made a version of their guide rail square that does work with this design. Now, fun fact, the Dewalt saw will not work with Makita tracks, but because the Festool track is slightly different on the T-track sidewall, you can make this Dewalt play nice with the Germans, so there's that. The best thing about this saw is the 60-volt single battery and the motor. The motor is awesome, one of the best I've tested. You can hear and feel how good it is. Here's the standard stock blade test on 2-inch thick hard maple compared to a thin kerf ripping blade. Now, even though it's not ideal, the saw handled the crosscut blade on this ripping cut better than expected. I was impressed. Now, for all of you Dewalt fanboys, I'm sorry for what I'm about to do here. Coming in hot at $619, I give this saw a score of 73 out of 100. C tier. Sorry, but not sorry. If you have a business or want to start a business, I think my story will inspire you. My main business is not making YouTube videos. It's this tool accessory store, and it's built with Shopify, who I asked to be the sponsor of today's video. There were some things about track saws that bothered me, like this hole in the side, or the sharp ends of a track, or how to store them in my small shop. I came up with some 3D printed solutions for myself, and now I offer them to the world using Shopify. I recently did the same thing with trim routers. We made this oversized base and custom designed this dust chute to collect most of the sawdust when routing. We just released these and have shipped over 700 around the world already. Now when people ask, how did you buy all those track saws or trim routers? I legitimately say Shopify, because without them, we wouldn't have been able to grow our business like we have. Now, I didn't go to business school and I don't know how to code, and it still blows my mind that someone like me can make an online store in a few clicks and then run a business from a web browser or a smartphone app. They figured out how to reduce the complexity of things with their technology. There's no need to code. They have a simple drag and drop store editor, which helps me easily make changes to my storefront anytime I want. They have this live view, which is awesome. It shows you in real time where people are viewing your store. The marketing tools are easy to use, and the back office dashboards and analytics help me oversee all of my operations. It's easy to track my orders, manage inventory, issue discounts, and create new product listings. If you have a business idea or already own a business, go to shopify.com/Whitworks to get started so you can build the life you want. All right, it's time we talk about the Japanese saws. So I'm thinking Japanese music. This is the 36-volt version and the single battery 40-volt version of Makita's track saw. We're going to review them together because there are so many similarities. Okay, I don't think the subscribers are gonna like that. We gotta find some like J-pop or something. I've always considered the build quality of Makita's lineup to be the best bang for your buck. If you've ever owned Makita tools, these are in line with the top quality that you've come to expect. Okay, this is getting out of hand. Can you just pick something soothing? There's one cool trick that both these saws do that no other saw does, and I haven't heard anyone ever talk about it. But before I gush about how much I love these saws, we need to point out the obvious flaws. First, there is no riving knife or anti-kickback system. Now, if you're only cutting plywood, this isn't a big deal, but the moment you start cutting wood that has tension in it, you do risk kickback and having the saw jump the track, which I've experienced several times. It's a pants changer for sure. Second, the depth gauge is in metric for everyone who got a real education. But those of us hicks from the good old US of A have trouble remembering that 20 millimeters is the same as 3/4 of an inch, basically. I prefer the way Ridgid, Milwaukee, and Festool do their depth stops, and I wish Makita had a fine-tune adjustment on theirs. Third, these saws have the option to add a Bluetooth chip for triggering dust extractors, but it's pricey and not very elegant. I've used them before and didn't think they were worth the high price tag. The bevel gauge readability and detents are good, and it returns to 90 accurately. I also appreciate the anti-tipping feature for bevel cuts. The hose port works with standard dust extraction hoses, and the guide rail follows the standard that Festool set with anti-slip grips that actually work, and they also make a 39-inch short rail as well as a 108-inch long rail. The profile works with common track saw clamps and, shocker, my favorite precision aftermarket accessories. Marrying the saw to the track is foolproof with these smooth knobs. So what's the cool feature I teased a few moments ago? All 3 versions of Makita's track saws will use a standard 20mm arbor track saw blade, but if you flip this piece around right here, the arbor is converted to a 5/8-inch arbor. So that means you can use a specialty track saw blade as well as a 6.5-inch 5/8 arbor circ saw blade that you get from the big box store. I don't know why every saw doesn't do this, but this is pretty brilliant and obviously cheap to do. I am very impressed with the brushless motors of both the 36 volt and the 40 volt saws. The corded Makita does not have a brushless motor, and you can definitely tell the difference. Here's how they sound. I like how the brushless motors break when you're done with it. I think by now you know how the ripping blade would compare to the stock crosscut blade, so instead of showing you that, I'm going to show you the 36 volt and the 40 volt in a race using the same ripping blade. I love the smooth and powerful motors on both of these models. I've always been a corded Makita guy, but these motors have won me over. I paid $720 for the entire 36 volt setup and $765 for the 40 volt setup. I give them a score of 87 and 85 respectively. B tier. Okay, we need a German soundtrack. I'm not kidding. The song is titled the Bratwurst Song. There's no way we can play that song. The Germans will cancel us. Festool, the inventor of the track saw and the first portable chainsaw, by the way. The build quality and fit and finish here is as good as it can get, and it should. This setup cost me almost $900. Instead of a riving knife, the TSC has an electronic anti-kickback system that can sense when kickback has occurred. It immediately shuts off the motor and applies a brake without ruining your blade. Okay, the music is a bit much here. No, we're just gonna roll with it? Okay. The saw has this onboard splinter guard which helps eliminate splintering on the waste side of your cut, and this allows you to have perfect cuts on both sides of your pieces. The depth gauge is easy to use with one hand, and I prefer this style over the threaded knob ones. The hose port works with standard dust extraction hoses naturally, and the dust extraction on this thing is the best out of all of the track saws that I've used. Oh, okay, thank you. That's better. The bevel gauge is good, but it's missing detents for the 22.5 degree. Otherwise, it's accurate, can tilt to -1 and 47 degrees, and when resetting to 90 degrees, it's dead on accurate. One complaint is the lack of an anti-tipping feature. I'm not sure why they don't have this. Marrying the saw to the track is smooth and firm with these knobs here, and changing the blade is the easiest out of all track saws. You pull this up and out pops a hidden hex key. With one plunge down, the saw lowers to the right position and locks the blade at the same time. So fun. It uses a special 160mm track saw blade with a 20mm arbor, and as you might expect, you paid premium for Festool's version of this. I have both the CMT and Festool options. CMT is definitely cheaper, but the Festool quality is great and gives a perfect cut. The motor on this thing is easily one of the smoothest ones I've ever used, and I like how the blade stops immediately when you're done. I'm pretty sure Festool invented the profile on these guide rails because most brands copied this geometry, and naturally, clamps and accessories are made to fit it, which is nice. And while you watch the Tiny Sean test, the thing that most people overlook with Festool is the 3-year all-inclusive warranty. They not only pay for shipping in both directions if there's a problem, but most of the time the repair is out the door in 48 hours. If you make your living with this saw, that is reason enough to drop the cheddar. I'm not even sure what that means, but now I'm hungry. And because the Bluetooth batteries turn on my dust extractor auto-magically, I gave it 5 extra bonus points. The Germans cleaned up here with a total score of 101. S tier.
What does Milwaukee sound like to you? A Ford truck commercial?
Milwaukee. Some of the best tools you can buy at the overpriced orange store. Now this saw is nice. The build quality, 10 out of 10. The blade is easy to change and the riving knife is nice and responsive, allowing for full plunges in material. Similar to Festool, it has an onboard splinter guard for your waist side piece. The depth adjustment is fantastic. You can easily adjust with a pinch of 2 fingers. Hands down, my favorite depth adjustment out of every track saw in the world. Accurate too, thanks to the fine-tune adjustment wheel. The bevel gauge readability and common angle detents are spot on, and the saw returns to 90 accurately without any issues. It has an anti-tipping feature for when you do bevel cuts. Marrying the saw to the track and removing slop in the base is easy and smooth with these quality knobs. The guide rail is top quality, comes in 3 sizes, and is the standard profile design. Thank you very much. There is a slight modification here to accommodate the anti-tipping lip, so beware of that if you're trying to buy another brand track for this saw. You can use standard track saw clamps and our favorite TSO upgrades without any issues. The smoothness and power of this brushless motor rivals the Festool TSC. Since you don't need another lesson in why you should never use a high tooth count crosscut blade to rip dense hardwood, let's see how the Milwaukee and Festool compare using a thin curve ripping blade. Well, crap. I didn't see that coming. And just remember, I'm a Makita and Festool fanboy. Speaking of Makita, I wonder what happens if we throw the Makita 40 volt and the Dewalt 60 volt in the race. As a Makita man and someone who sips the green Kool-Aid, I think it's safe to say that I'm now a recent Milwaukee convert, and still a firm Dewalt troll. The Milwaukee saw really surprised me. I have to give it a solid score of 99 out of 100. A tier. My dad claims he can tell a lot about a motor by how it sounds, so this is for you, Dad. Happy Father's Day, even though it's November.
There's a great quote that says, social media, where nuance goes to die. I think that's spot on, and I'm going to ignore that here for a moment because I have a lot of nuanced thoughts on this stuff. Now, obviously, this is not an exhaustive review of track saws. And here's the thing that most reviewers don't say on any of these YouTube videos. These reviews don't need to be that exhaustive. I have 20 track saws up there that you can't see, and every one of them, if you marry the saw to the track and you have a clean blade with the right tooth count and a rubber splinter guard that is intact, they all make great cuts. Doesn't matter if it's a $100 saw or a $1,000 saw. Now, obviously there's differences in the motors, in the fit and finish quality, but after that, it's really a question of how much money do you want to spend? Do you want to be a part of their system? And what's your favorite color and battery that you're already bought into? Is Tiny Sean the most scientific test? No, I'm not a scientist. I'm not an engineer. As you can see, I'm a colors and shapes kind of guy. The reason why I do this test is because over a year and a half ago, a subscriber named Tiny Sean asked me how this Milwaukee saw would cut 2 inches of hard maple. So I went out and bought a 2-inch thick slab of hard maple and I started making some cuts. He ended up sending me $80 to help cover the cost of the maple, and that's why he owns the naming rights. A controlled experiment in a lab with robots would be interesting, but I think a real person in a real workshop with some real hardwood and a real saw is kind of good enough for me. Now, one comment that often gets left on these videos, which makes me just laugh, is people say, you shouldn't cut 2 inches in one pass. You should do it in 2 passes. And you shouldn't use a cross-cutting blade. Obviously, but the point of this is to stress the motor. It's a stress test. I don't recommend doing full plunges on hardwood like this, and I don't recommend using a cross-cut blade, but using that, I feel like, gives you a good idea of how far you can push these saws. Some nuanced thoughts on Makita. I'm a Makita guy, and so I was really surprised that these scored lower in my system. Now, I've looked through all of the product listing pages and the manuals, and I'm really surprised that there's not an electronic anti-kickback system. The manual does say there's an overload protection system, but it doesn't specify that it's triggered during kickback. And in the manuals, there's even a kickback section, and it doesn't talk about anything like that. It just tells you how to avoid it with your technique. I feel like I am wrong in saying that these don't have an anti-kickback system. And yet I can't find any literature that says that they do. But one thing worth mentioning is that they do have what they call a high-speed mode and a high torque mode, where the motor can dynamically change the speed based on what it's sensing, which is kind of cool. I don't think Makita knows who I am, but if they ever find this video, if you change the depth scale, add a riving knife or anti-kickback system, and make a more affordable way to wirelessly connect any vacuum, then I think you might be the undisputed champion. But then again, I'm biased. So which is my favorite track saw? Actually, not these. It's this, the corded Festool TS60. Out of all 20 track saws I have, including the big TS55, this is the most powerful track saw, and I love using it. It's basically perfect. But since this is a cordless video, we're going with this. Since manufacturers are going full send into cordless mode, I have been using these cordless track saws in a lot of my projects to get a sense of how they perform. I've been in the camp that a corded saw is just fine for me, especially if you already have a hose, and it is a first world luxury privilege, but I have gotten used to the convenience of having a cordless track saw, even though it kind of doesn't make sense if you're already connecting it with a hose. I'm not a Milwaukee fanboy or power user, but I have to give them credit. This is one of the best, if not the best track saw that you could find. But the only reason why I use this one more than this is because the Bluetooth motors wirelessly turn on my dust extractor. Now, said expensive dust extractor does have a Bluetooth remote, but I'm embarrassed to admit how many times I'm in a project and I just get in the zone and I forget to turn this on. I know it's embarrassing and dumb. So here's what I think Milwaukee can do to make this better. Milwaukee, you're one Bluetooth battery away from being the king of track saws. If you can make a Bluetooth battery that connects to your own version of a smart plug so that you can plug this into any vacuum or dust extractor and it will turn on and trick the vacuum into thinking there's a current, then I think this would be my #1 favorite track saw of all time. Well, to quote the great philosopher Gerald and Dunn, all right, I'm done.